When you hear the word Tevis, what's the first thing that comes to mind?
Greatest thing I've ever done other than the birth of my children. It was just amazing the first time I finished Tevis.
How about you, Chuck?
I've spent my life looking for interesting adventures, and I hear Tevis, and I think that's one of the most fascinating adventures somebody can get involved in. And that was my whole purpose of writing it the first time, and I've been back many times.
It's just special to be able to ask your horse to do that and ask your body to do that. It was wonderful. And you know, even though right now I'm pretty sore and say, oh, I don't ever want to do that again, I'm sure in a few days I'm going to say, you know what, that was neat and I do want to do that journey again.
I've told people for years that Tevis was like a drug, and that it's one of those events that once you do it, you either are totally hooked or you'll never touch it again.
And some kind of experience that you can't match it up with anything else, whether you're riding it or you're crewing or you're working it or you're just spectating or you're taking pictures or whatever the case may be, that any type of involvement at all with the ride will leave you with something, you know, that you couldn't have obtained anywhere else.
Interesting adventures, and I hear Tevis, and I think that's one of the most fascinating adventures somebody can get involved in. And that was my whole purpose of writing it the first time, and I've been back many times.
Now Chuck, you were a runner before you were a rider.
That's correct. I'm one of the 37 triple cripples. And the triple cripples are those that have done the run, the ride, and the ride and tie championship.
So as far as the ride is concerned, after you'd already accomplished something as big as running, Chuck, you know, you mentioned Judy Gerhardt, and I want Judy to be, you know, known for all the influence she's had in our sport.
Yeah,
because she left us few years ago, and
she brought so many people into the sport, especially the youngsters. There was a number of years that my grandkids were in her summer program. Just a lot of fun, great person. And then recently, of course, Joe Gerhardt passed away. Another one that was, he was a Marine, by the way. And
Semper Fi.
Yes, Semper Fi. Just great people, and they did so much for the community and the horse world. The word is when Judy rode Tevis, she had to stop and nurse Andrew along the way. So pretty dedicated horsewoman.
I would say so.
Which means Andrew's been on the trail a long time.
A lot longer than us.
Yes, he has. And he just finished Virginia City this last weekend.
Yeah.
So yeah, Judy, I know she helped you with the training that this horse as well, and was a big part of that. And so Mike, I remember your first.
Yeah,
Tevis.
94, and I had been a horseman my entire life since I was a young kid.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't start endurance riding until 94. I was probably 48 or so by then. Corey Saltow, who's got, I think, 18 finishes, was my vet. I used to live in Danville, and he used to talk about endurance riding all these years, and I had no idea what he was talking about. Eventually, I had enough time and a couple of buddies, Bob Marks and Maynard Munger, we decided we were going to do it, and Corey was kind of our mentor. And we made a number of trips from Danville up to the Western States Trail, pre-road, and that's how I got hooked. I did one endurance ride, the Mount Diablo ride, 50 mile, before I did Tevis the first time.
That's kind of interesting what he just said. He did one endurance ride, Tevis. I did one endurance ride,
That's right.
Tevis. And that was so common back a number of years ago.
Yeah.
And now, of course, there's the qualifications that you have to go through. But it was real common for people to get involved, not that they were riding minimally. We did a lot of riding, just we didn't compete a lot.
Right,
Right.
right. And, you know, there could be advantages and disadvantages to that. I mean, we have so many rides now, every weekend. You could go do an endurance ride.
Yeah.
And you know, some of these horses may be coming into this ride overtrained and compromised, you know, because of that. You know, where in the early days, there was only so many rides to do before Tevis.
And that's,
Especially locally.
yeah, when you say some of them come in overtrained, where they're doing that new criteria, where they're looking at the horse, too thin, too worn out, and that's a brand new thing, and I think it's a result of some of these excess rides people are doing.
It's a good thing.
Oh,
Yeah.
it is a good thing.
So another aspect with your doing the ride is that you Chuck and Mike have also been very involved in the Board of Governors of the
Right.
Western States Trail Foundation and have been instrumental in keeping this ride going. You know, share some experiences while, you know, being president and ride director of the Tevis.
Yeah.
You know, what are some of your experiences that you most remember?
The reason I got involved with the board and involved with the trail and putting on the ride, after the first time I rode it, I was so amazed at the trail. I mean, it was absolutely beautiful. And then all the volunteers that were so helpful. I thought, I've got to give back, so I wanted to get involved. And I got on the board in 1996 and subsequently served 3 terms as president and then 3 years as the ride director. I would have to say the first year that I was the ride director might be the most memorable. I worked all year long with my committee to get ready to go. Tom Kristoff was the president that year. A fire started in June, and by the time we were ready to go with that ride sometime in July, that fire was still going, and we had to cancel the ride about a week before it was to occur. And I'll never forget that as my first my first year as ride director.
So let's talk a little bit about that, because that was kind of an epic, you know, event
Yeah.
in Tevis history.
Yeah.
And so right up to the end, I mean, were you just hoping that there would be a change in you know, in the fire situation, just thinking, okay, when do we make this cancellation and announce it?
Yeah.
Because you know, I mean, that had to been a very difficult decision.
Yeah, it was, and I worked very closely with Tom on that. About a week before the ride, I was able to get up to Robinson Flat with one of the U.S. Forest Service people. By then, that fire was right at the top of the canyon up there, and we were standing up there. Ashes were falling on us. The air quality was absolutely terrible. Plus, that fire was burning and then exploding, and it was out of control. So there was no way from a safety standpoint for riders, crew, everybody that, and the horses that we could let it go on. So it was just about a week before the ride. We made the right decision. It kind of hurt to do it, but I'm glad we did it.
Well, it's always about the horse.
Right.
When the decision was made, they had a group of people come into the Tevis office, and we were sitting there for about 2 hours, each of us with a stack of entries, calling the people, telling them, turn around, go back, or looking at their emergency numbers, somehow getting a message to them. And in about 2 hours, we got a hold of somebody for every rider in the ride. And one of the best things that came out of that, refunds were offered, and many of the riders said, keep the money.
Yeah.
Well, Chuck, you've been president.
I was president for 1 year, yes.
And you also have been instrumental on the trail maintenance of this.
Yeah,
the
I
Western
was
States Trail.
invited onto the board. Mike was invited on the board because I sponsored him by saying he's a good cook.
And he is a good
And
cook.
he's a good cook. And we were able to take advantage of some of his other talents along the way. I was promoted onto the board for trail work, and that's been my love of the thing all along. Very, very active. In the last few years, joining with the run and the two groups together, maintaining most of the trail. The run has its own separate part, and so does the ride. But other than that, it's a joint effort now.
It's a lot of work, and it's a labor of love.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
And you look at the trail, it's constantly changing. With weather issues and each year poses its own challenges. What section of the trail are you most concerned with, knowing that trail so well, to keep maintained so we can keep this ride going?
It depends on the year, and you can't say one area constant. For instance, down by Driver's Flat, we had a fire in there 10 years ago. For the next 5-6 years, it was constant trees coming down. So, and when I say constant, right up to the week before the ride, there were trees coming down. So that's finally resolved. Well, now we have another fire area up above and trying to deal with it. This particular year, the snows played havoc all over the trail with trees and brush down and washouts. So there isn't a area that you say, I'm going to just spend the rest of my career dealing with. It depends on the year.
Along with that, the trail, of course, is so important. Without the trail, there wouldn't be a ride. And around 1996, the board decided that we wanted to establish an endowment fund. Jeff Hurton, one of our board members, came up with the unique idea of adopting a section of the trail. And our goal, through charter and incorporation, was to raise $500,000 and never touch the principal of that, but only use the interest and dividends to spend on the trail. And we felt if we could get to that level that, we'd be able to keep the trail going forever. We reached that level a number of years ago. Currently, we're up around $700,000, and we spent $250,000 just a couple of years ago when we participated in the acquisition of the Granite Chief area private land property in conjunction with a number of other foundations to make sure that the trail would be preserved forever. So that's been an important part of the organization's endeavors.
Well, a question for both of you would be, as involved as you've been in the ride, how many buckles?
I have 5.
5 and
Three.
3. And then the other side, which is keeping this ride going. What kind of future do you want to see? What do you want to see the direction that the Tevis, the ride, goes?
I'd like to see it continue with many of the traditions that it has now. I'm coming from kind of a purist background, and to be honest, I kind of get a little put out when they need more water, when they need more vet stops, when they make more exceptions to try and increase the completion rate, when this trail is for an adventure. And if you pave it, you're not getting that. So I'd like to see that some of the real traditions maintained.
How about you, Mike?
Yeah, I would agree with Chuck 100%. I think part of the challenge is that single track trail, all those canyons, the beautiful views, and it gives you a chill when you're riding some of those sections. That if you made a bad step, it could be it could be serious. But you know, that's part of the whole mystique of the ride, I think, and I'd like to see that continue.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I agree with you too. So you know, in endurance, I'm going to ask this question. You know, you talk about tradition, and you know, the sport. There's always going to be, you know, Tevis considered a race versus a ride, and so can we touch on that topic a little bit?
Sure, go ahead.
Sure, okay. Since Mike and I ride a little bit differently, my first Tevis ride was on Dusty, and that was that horse that I got from Janie, and I rode that ride to finish. Every other one I've ridden to be way up in the front.
Yeah.
And I finished 12th twice, 6th and 10th. And the year I was 6th, I was 6 minutes behind the winner. So never competitive enough to win the thing, but competitive enough that, damn, I like to ride fast. And as a result, I have 5 non-finishes.
Yeah, and I always rode to finish. I never rode to race or come in first. Interesting, when I first got on the board, one of my mentors was Bill Piper, who he was president of the foundation for 13 years, and we lost Bill just a few years ago. But I remember talking to him early on. He always wanted to call the Tevis a ride, not a race. And it used to bother him when people would refer to it as a race. And I think it goes back to it's a ride, and making sure that the horse is number one is so important. And sure, I can agree with if you've got the horse and you've got the time to train and come in the top 10, I think that's great. But I always kind of think of it as a ride and not necessarily a race.
And I think that's maybe the great thing about our sport is you can come into it with whatever attitude you want, and it's a personal goal. It's to finish and to get that buckle is a big deal. And then, you know, if you feel like you've got the horse. Chuck, you talked about your successes with your top 10 finishes and that, but you also mentioned poles, which is a big part of this ride, considering that only about 50% actually finish this ride.
I'm right on the 50%.
You're on the 50%.
I've started 10 times and finished 5.
Okay. So tell us about the poles.
Okay, one of them, I think you're going to be interviewing Tom Kristoff here somewhere along the line. We started one year, and we were riding pretty competitively in the front, maybe 9th or 10th at the start, going fast. And a horse in front of me kicked out and hit my horse in the head. And I thought, oh man. And Tom was right over here. I said, Tom, check out my horse's head. I think, make sure it's not caved in. And he looks over and he says, your horse is fine, but you're screwed. And about that time, I realized my reins weren't attached to anything. He had kicked and caught the headstall and ripped it off. So I have a runaway horse and just flying down the trail. And Tom says, oh, don't worry, I'll take care of you, Chuck. And he pulled ahead a little bit, and his horse kicked me in the leg. And Tom said, well, I guess I can't help you, and off he goes. Well, Frank Smith was riding his mule, and Frank got his mule in front of me, and so George, my horse, would start to go to the left. Say, Frank left, and he pulled the mule over. Frank to the right, and we went that way until that road area comes up the hill before you drop down down to the bridges and stuff. And up there, we were able to pull off and get my reins hooked onto the halter that I was having. So that was my start. By the time I got to Forest Hill, my leg was so sore I couldn't even stay in the saddle. So I went home. So there was one pull.
That was a rider option.
Yeah, and that was Kristoff. Where is he? It was his fault. One year it started, and I know my horse pretty darn well. And coming into Robinson Flat, I always know where I get off and walk in so that he will be down heart rate down when I get there. So at the spot, he'd been running a little higher than he normally does as I was riding, and I got off, walked in, and he wasn't coming down. So I knew immediately I had an issue. And that was one. Went to the vets and said, look him over, I think I'm going home, he's not right. And the vets, they said, well, he looks okay, it's kind of your choice, but he was not right, and we went home. A couple days, the next day I took his temperature and it was elevated. So he was, one of those things that not the right day to be taking him down the trail. One of the best or worst finishes, or non-finishes, got to Francisco's, and horse was marginal, and I knew it, and went to the vets, and we talked about it, and I said, listen, let me just walk. I don't want to pull here at Francisco's. This is the god-awful place. I will get off. I'll walk him to Lower Quarry. And I knew the vets, and they said, okay. So I got to Lower Quarry and said, look him over good. I think we're going home. And he peed brown, and they said, yep, you're going home. I was 5th at the time.
Even walking him.
Yeah. So I mean, it was way ahead. But, friends started calling me old 5 Mile. 5 miles from the finish, I went home.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, the one thing about getting pulled at Francisco's is the walk up Driver's Flat.
Yeah,
I've been pulled there myself.
Yeah, that's just a slap in the face. I didn't want to do that. And again, knew the vets, and they said, yeah, go on, Chuck, and did the right thing. I got him there, and everything was fine. An easy pull. I was first horse pulled from there.
Well, what I liked hearing was you knew there was problems.
Oh yeah.
Before the vets did, and you were calling it before they did, and that's horsemanship.
Yeah.
And that's very important in our sport.
Yeah.
To have
so let's see. That's a couple of the pulls. Another pull, I was always off running down the canyon, and running down to the swinging bridge. There's some a couple of rock areas you may recall, right close to the bottom, and I was in front running, and I could feel the horse's rear end went under him, slipped under him, and walked very slow getting up to the top because it tweaked his rear end. So I got to pull there. I was 3rd at that point. Like I was telling you, I like to ride fast.
That's go big or go home.
And you suffer the consequences when you do. Had I been walking down there, it wouldn't have been an issue.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Mike, you mentioned you have 3 buckles.
Right.
And you have 1 pull.
Right.
And so maybe you can talk about your pull.
Yeah, actually, my pull was actually my first start, and I rode the same horse all 4 starts, so I finished 3 on him and pulled once. That first year that I pulled, it was at Forest Hill, and he was doing fine, but I could tell he was a little bit off on his right front, and it wasn't in the stars that year to go on and finish. I was riding with Bob Marks to that point, and I said, Bob, I'm pulled. And he said, well, I'm not going to go on. And I said, Bob, you have to go on. And he did, and he finished. Another remembrance that I have of a kind of a difficult ride was I come into Robinson Flat, and my friend Walt Tibbetts is there. He's 72 that year. It's 1996. He was going for his 10th buckle. And I started talking to him, and he said, I don't feel good. His horse was fine. I don't feel good, Mike. I'm going to quit. And I said, no, you're not. I'm going to ride with you. And I did. We got in at 4:45, just barely under the wire. And I remember when we left Forest Hill, I was trotting down the trail in California Loop, and he was following, and he said, can we slow down? And we almost walked the entire rest of the ride and just barely made it. But he got his 10th buckle, and I think that's the last time he rode.
And that's got to be satisfying for you to help Walt, one of the pioneers of our sport. Through the ride.
Yeah.
And to say you rode with him.
Yeah.
And that brings up, you guys both of you started in the early 90s. But you probably also had an opportunity to meet and work with like Bill Piper and some of these early pioneers of our sport that were right there with Wendell Roby.
Yeah.
Making this the ride it is today.
Yeah.
Who are some of those riders and those people that come to mind?
Yeah.
That just were big inspirations to you.
Well, besides Walt Tibbetts, who was obviously one, another one that we rode, both Chuck and I rode with, was Bud Darty, who actually holds the fastest time for finishing the Tevis ever, and wonderful man. And in later years, we rode with him on the Frontier Boys ride, which is kind of a social ride, not a endurance ride, but he's one that goes way back.
His first ride was in the 60s.
Yeah, right.
And he was Hagen Cup winner in the 60s.
Oh,
Yeah.
So when somewhere along the line, Walt gave me a number of his buckles, and which I donated to the office for the giveaway, except he also gave me his Hagen Cup buckle and medallion. And when he passed at his memorial, I gave that to his daughter, so she got it. Yeah.
Wow. Are there any other riders and that come to mind?
Certainly Gordon Palmer, who was my shoer at one point, and 10 finishes, and he also ran the Western States 100. I know he was a good friend of yours, Chuck.
Who's your shoer now?
Well, Jim Mather,
Oh, okay.
your son.
Yeah, and those were pretty much the people I was involved with. Mike being in the sport, not necessarily endurance, but in the horse world a lot longer than I was, he knew a lot of these people way before I did. Walt was the one I rode a lot with in the early days, my early days.
Right.
And it was so neat because he was one of the few people, he lived in Moraga at the time, one of the few people that would be at Auburn at 7 in the morning so we could go ride. So often you get to the overlook at 7 in the morning, there's nobody there. About 10 o'clock they roll in. Shoot, 10 o'clock, we're done.
Now, Mike, you're from the Bay Area.
Right.
Now, was it Tevis that brought you up here to the foothills?
Actually, it was.
Now that's interesting because there's a lot of people that came from all over the country, really, that moved here specifically to be near that trail, and you were one of those people.
I'm one of them. I moved in early 96, the end of 95, and it was a point in my life where my kids were done with college and out of the house, and I had flexibility, and I was interested in Tevis, and I said, why not? And so I moved up. There was already people I knew that had moved up here ahead of me from the Bay Area, and it was a great move. Chuck and I met at that time too and started training together. And then Chuck actually introduced me to my wife, Tish. And
So far, they still like me.
and so far, 21 years later, we're still married. Yeah,
Wow. So it was a life changer. This ride was a life changer for you.
absolutely. Yeah,
Wow. You moved, you met your wife.
Yeah.
I mean, you could really, say a lot about how this ride influenced your life.
it influenced a lot. Yeah.
As it turns out, Mike and I went to high school together, but we didn't know each other back then.
Wow. Wow, what a small world.
Of course, he's much older than me.
Much.
So, Chuck, we were talking about your, starting off with the running, and prior to that, I mean, you were a Marine in Vietnam,
Yes.
and and what's interesting because I'm also going to be talking to Tom Kristoff, who also was a Marine.
Well, sort of a Marine. He was an officer, so that kind of lowers him
Yeah,
down.
he
a
didn't
little
work
bit.
for a living.
No, not at all.
But just that focus that you have from your military experience and everything else, it had to have lended to this goal setting that has gotten you through a lot of things in life, but setting goals to run the run and also to do the ride.
Yeah, I think that's right. When I'm doing things, Janie often says, that's the Marine in you coming out. And I don't know if I had that before the Marines, but I certainly had a lot of drive coming out of there. When I got out of the Marines, I knew there's some things I wanted to do and some things I didn't want to do. And I put myself through college, and then off to the work environment, rose in work about as far as I could go, played very competitive sports, and ultimately the run. Can I divert just slightly on the run? I gotta tell you this fun story about how I got involved in the run. My wife at the time, prior wife, worked for Hart Federal Savings, which was Wendell Roby's bank. And they were having their annual picnic at the Auburn Rec Park. And so we were all having a picnic, and this is nice, and I had to go to the bathroom, so I walked over to the outhouse there. And a guy comes walking in, and he puts his arms against the wall, and he's going to the bathroom. I said, geez, are you all right? He says, yeah, I'm great. I just ran 100 miles. And that was in 1978. And I said, that is amazing. And I came back out, and I went to my wife. I said, just amazing. See those guys over there? That's their award ceremony for a 100-mile run. And there was like 12, I don't remember what it was. There wasn't many. And she says, look at all those misspent goals. Think about what they could do if they really put their minds to good stuff. Well, I swapped out wives and ran it. So that was my introduction to the run.
Wow. Well, bringing back to, I just have to bring this up. My mentor was Dr. Barslow. And, and so he was a Marine.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And so I had that background with him. I was Army, by the way. So, but, I think there has to be a certain something in somebody to want to do the run or the ride. And we're talking about the ride now, but there has to, what do you think that little piece of whatever it is that makes a person want to ride a horse 100 miles?
Wow, I think, I think it's the challenge. I think to me, it was being able to not only get myself, although I wasn't running it, but riding it. You still need to get in shape, get into condition, get your horse ready, and then the challenge of getting yourself and your horse through safely and healthy at the end was just a goal that seemed like a really worthy goal, and it inspired me.
I like what he said. I think my first ride was an adventure ride, and the rides after that were challenges because I had different goals. But I think what makes things successful for me is being able to set my priorities. And during certain times of the year, the highest priority, other than family and that, is training. Yeah. And you put in you get back what you put in. And I always thought that if you train hard, you can ride easy. And that's worked for me. But it's being able to change priorities throughout the year to be able to accomplish something that you want to do.
Well, you guys, is there anything else you want to add? You feel like you need to talk about the history of our ride? Anything that you feel that the public needs to know?
Yeah.
One item, at the Overlook, there's a plan in place to be able to build, is it, call it an interpretive wall?
Yes.
And that'll be able to have a wall that'll have the history of the ride as far as the areas, the trail spots along it will be marked out on this wall. So we're pretty excited about that.
Yeah.
Hopefully within the next year or two, we'll be able to get that going.
Yeah, we've been working on that. We call the Auburn staging area for a dozen years or so. Put a lot of effort into acquiring another 2 acres that's adjacent to the original staging area on the north side of the canal. we've had, both Chuck and I have put a lot of work into that, and Tom Kristoff also. It's tough going working with federal agencies, state agencies. They're slow, and it's a slog to get things done, but we are getting things done. And, that's part of the goal of the foundation, is to make the trail available to the public, to educate the public about the trail. And so that's a primary goal for both of us.
Okay. Well, I want to thank both of you for working so hard and on the trail, on our ride, and I just appreciate everything you guys have done.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you.